Welcome to the world of Carry On. In this series, we're going to take a look behind the scenes at how some of the greatest Carry On films were ever made. In this edition, we look at the classic 1970 film Carry On Lovin'. So let's meet the cast before they get hitched up. Sidney James as Sidney Bliss. Kenneth Williams as Percival Snooper. Charles Hawtrey as James Bedsop. Joan Sims as Esme Crowfoot. Hattie Jakes as Sophie Bliss. Terry Scott as Terence Philpott. Richard O'Callaghan as Bertram Muffet. Bernard Breslaw as Gripper Burke. Jackie Piper as Sally Martin. And Carry On newcomer Imogen Hassel as Jenny Grubb. The 20th Carry On film in the series, Carry On Lovin', hit our screens in 1970, but life for this film started in late 1969, when scriptwriter Talbot Rothwell was already penning this film, even before the previous film, Carry On Up the Jungle, had even started shooting at Pinewood Studios. Carry On producer Peter Rogers had commissioned a marriage agency comedy under the title of Carry On Courting. However, by the time of the pre-production meeting on the 25th of March 1970, the title had already been changed to Carry On Lovin'. Indeed, Peter Rogers had registered the title with the Film Production Association of Great Britain in November of 1970, along with another film called Girls That Go Bump in the Night, which sadly was never put into production. Although the Carry On battle with the British Board of Film Classifications had been hotting up, ironically, the most passionate of subjects sailed through the vetting of the censor with ease. Fittingly, with a more sexual and three-wheeling plot than usual, an influx of new talent was introduced to complement the latest Carry On girl, Jackie Piper. Imogen Hassel and Richard O'Callaghan successfully merged with the establishing team players. Newspaper tabloid The Times applauded the naive performance of Richard O'Callaghan and reflected on how refreshing it was to see a new face in the series. They went on to say that he plays the innocent character with absolutely the right single-minded seriousness and apparent unconsciousness of the humour of his own situation. Carry On regular Peter Butterworth was awarded the memorable cameo role simply identified as the client, in brackets, mushrooms. His deadpan delivery of the corny murderous gag was intended to be a surprise appearance. He was paid £125 for just one day's work on the 10th of April of 1970. Another cameo role that sadly was cut was that of Mr. Rooksby, played by Dad's Army actor James Beck. The beloved Wild Boy, Private Walker, from 1968 until his untimely death in 1973. The glamorous Huguette Stansgaard played his wife and also ended up on the cutting room floor. Publicity for Carry On Lovin' was full on, with Imogen Hassel and Jackie Piper featuring in Titbits, and the entire cast paraded for local newspaper stories. One of the wackiest promotional suggestions was for the local cinemas showing the film to organise a street parade of 13 glamorous young ladies in miniskirts and sweaters, each one to be embezzled with the letters spelling out the film. It was hoping that they could capture something else. Sadly, it didn't quite come to fruition. So with a little bit of history behind the film, let's now have a look at the film in brief and get an idea of what the story is all about. The film starts at the station Much Snogging on the Green, as we see Bertram Muffet waving goodbye to Terence Philpott, who seems to have got quite friendly with his wife. Bertram now seeks new advice by making his way to the Wedded Bliss Agency to try and fit him up with a new wife. Running the Wedded Bliss Agency is Sidney Bliss and his wife Sophie Bliss, otherwise known as Sophie Plummet, because they're not really married. The modern of miracle technology, the dating computer, is run by just a piece of cardboard being placed through a hole on the other side of the wall. But unbeknown to Bertie Muffet, he has been paired up with Esme Crowfoot, a long-time love rival for Sophie Bliss, as Sid always seems to be popping in there for a bit. Meanwhile, at the Citizens Advice Bureau, we're introduced to Percival Snooper, who is sexually backward. His poor marital advice really does bring down the whole of the Citizens Advice Bureau. In fact, he couldn't ask a constipated cow to give her laxatives. Terry Scott is paired up with Jenny Grubb. When he goes to their household to meet the family, it seems rather a strange meeting. In fact, he can't wait to get out of there. Meanwhile, Sophie doesn't trust Sid one little bit and decides to call him James Bedsop, who thinks he's a bit like James Bond really, except the trouble is he's not very good at what he does. But he decides to follow Sid around for most of the film. Bertie Muffet ends up meeting the wrong girl and ends up getting paired with Sally Martin. After seeing her in barely anything, he makes a run for it and decides to reconvene his original date with Esme Crowfoot. Meanwhile, Sid is getting quite comfy in Esme Crowfoot's bedroom. Then all of a sudden there's a knock on the door. It's wrestler Gripper Burke, ex-partner of Esme Crowfoot. Sid makes his escape on the balcony in the pouring rain, but for poor old Bertram Muffet, he ends up with a few fractures and ends up in hospital. Once in hospital, Sally Martin decides to visit him, and it appears they have more in common than they bargained for and decide to carry on dating. Sophie Bliss decides to pay a visit to Percival Snooper and basically lays it down on the table in front of him. Quite literally. Well, love that is anyway. Sophie decides to leave Sid, and in the end, she decides to go round to his house for a night of, romance. She gets quite the opposite, in fact. Sid decides to hatch a plan with Esme Crowfoot and decides to descend upon the house, proving that basically it's her that she's interested and not Esme Crowfoot. This brings Sid and Sophie back together, and they decide to throw a big whacking party to celebrate all the happy couples that they've brought together. It ends in a traditional carry-on pie fight, and that's the end of the film. The film was released in September of 1970 and was the fourth most popular film at the British box office of the following year, 1971. This film seems to be quite an average carry-on for most. Most people rate it as a series of sketches linked together based around the love theme, while some believe that it has not got the typical carry-on style that all the others had previously had of the swinging 60s. Dave Parkinson of the Radio Times awarded the film just 2 out of 5 stars, going on to say, "It was a patchy entry into the series where too much time was spent on other clients of the Bureau at the expense of the proprietors and the characters played by Joan Sims and Kenneth Williams." The film seems to be one of the weaker of the 1970s, having been in the great period of the 1960s, and we have a little lull period before it boosts itself right up to the great Carry On Abroad some 3 years later. With its mixed reviews though, it does provide great entertainment and some very great laughs. And whilst this one isn't the best, it's by no means the worst. Until next time, carry on laughing.